Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. This is Jana from Bloomberg Law. First of all, sorry that this is in English and not Italian, but our guests today don't speak Italian, so we thought that we're going to be doing some translating with English and Hungarian, and already that was complicated enough, so we're just going to stick to English, but again, we apologize. So hopefully everyone who's interested can still follow and participate and understand. So without further ado, in the late 1980s, Hungary was the poster child of democratic development in Central Europe. But today, with Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party in power since 2010, the country has become what our guest describes as a hybrid authoritarian state. Political economist Gabor Schering is here to discuss his new book, The Retreat of Liberal Democracy, Authoritarian Capitalism and the Accumulative State in Hungary. It's the first empirical economic study seeking to understand what changed in Hungary and why since 2010. Gabor is a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of Political and Social Sciences at Bocconi University in Milan. He also served as a member of the Hungarian Parliament from 2010 to 2014, and he comes from a working class family in Budapest. Both of these experiences have informed his research, as we're going to hear later. In about 25 minutes, the Mayor of Budapest, Gergely Karácsony, will also be joining us. And we have Gabor's wife, Noemi Schering Ola, who will translate for Gergely once he joins us. So let's go straight to the book. Gabor, can you first start by explaining what is a hybrid or a competitive authoritarian state, and when did this shift take place in Hungary?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to introduce the book, and I'm also sorry for speaking in English and not being able to to do this in Italian. So a hybrid regime is a regime that is in between a democracy and a dictatorship. So it's this new murky middle ground that is emerging all around the world. These are regimes that preserve some elements of democratic decision-making. Like typically you would have some form of election, more or less free elections. But the other institutional requirements of a well-functioning liberal democracy aren't really there, or aren't there to the extent that make these regimes a really functioning democracy. So that's why they are called hybrid regime. And the term competitive authoritarianism captures that it's an authoritarian regime, but you have some degree of competition between political forces. But these political forces, they have vastly different access to the media and vastly different resources that they can use to run campaigns, and also the institutional background is vastly favoring the ruling party. So this is not just Hungary, but you can see this in other countries around the world.
And when did this shift start to take place in Hungary, and what were some of the ways that it manifested?
So the quality of liberal democracy and the institutional structure started to decline in the second half of the 2000s. So that is already before Viktor Orban took power. But the really major and dramatic shift started in 2010. That is when Viktor Orban, the current Prime Minister of Hungary, was elected back to power. He was a Prime Minister also between 1998 and 2002. But back then he was more of a regular centrist conservative politician. But then after losing the election in 2002, he started to transform Fidesz party, and the structural problems and the social and economic disintegration that the country was facing by that time allowed him to catapult back to power in 2010 with a 2/3 majority. And he basically immediately started to restructure the institutional landscape, starting with the rewriting of the constitution. So there's a new constitution, a new electoral law, and all the major independent institutions are run by someone closely affiliated to Orbán or Fidesz, so they aren't really independent anymore. And this institutional setup is designed to, it's a playing field that tilts heavily in favor of Fidesz.
Okay. So with this book, you set out to answer several questions, but I really want to focus on two of them. And those are, first of all, why did this democratic backsliding happen? And also, what lessons does Hungary hold for other countries experiencing similar phenomenon? So just some background for everyone who's listening. This was 4 years of research, both qualitative and quantitative, right? You did interviews with 82 people to understand their subjective experiences, 82 working class people, and you created new data sets, studied existing data sets, but what was missing when you set out? Sort of why hadn't these questions been adequately answered?
Yes, so the book presents a causal narrative, a causal narrative that has been missing. It's not a full explanation of what happened in Hungary, but it focuses on the political economic dimension and its interaction with Viktor Orbán's strategy and in political science is called agency. So the way politicians maneuver these structural opportunities. And there are, I think, two mistakes that are frequently made, both in Hungary, but also when it comes to populist rurals and politicians and their success in the West, in Western Europe or the US. These mistakes are frequently, you can observe them as well there. So one is, let's put it this way, confusing Viktor Orbán with Orbánism. So the whole political phenomena cannot be reduced to just one single politician that has gone rogue and is destroying everything. Of course, he's the most important player, and you can't understand the process without looking at him. But just zooming in on him and his actions, we don't really understand the underlying structural causes, the tensions that are there in society, that were there already before he launched his power grab and actually allowed him to do so. So it's the same as, like, for example, mistaking Trump with Trumpism. You can, I personally, I'm very, very relieved with the outcome of the elections in the US, but I also don't think that the problems that the US is facing would be, unfortunately, simply fixed by just getting rid of Mr. Trump and removing him from the White House. So Trumpism as a political phenomenon, as a kind of right-wing authoritarian-leaning populism, will remain. So there are structural underlying causes behind the political strategies. That's one of the arguments. And the other is when people recognize that it's more than just one person, and then they refer to culture, right? So mistaking Orbánism with the culture of illiberal legacies, with the culture of nationalism, the culture of racism, which are all there, but again, in themselves, don't explain what has happened in Hungary. For example, just a very simple fact, the migration crisis hit Hungary in 2015 and later, and Viktor Orbán already won 2 elections with 2/3 majority in 2010 and 14, when the migration crisis was not a salient issue. And survey research has also found that there was a very high support for liberal institutions and liberal values before Mr. Orbán took power. So if you really look at the data, you don't really see an illiberal cultural demand for this kind of authoritarian turn. Certainly, there are nationalist legacies, going back to Hungary's history after the First World War, when Hungary lost territories. This influences opportunities, but in themselves, they don't really explain what has been happening. So these were the two main explanations that are very frequently provided, and I think we need a new focus on economics and social tensions, and that's what I did in the book.
Right, and in your book, you say that this idea that there's just something sort of rotten in the culture is actually an idea that's often put forth by Hungarian elites, right? And so this comes from a lack of attention, perhaps, to the working class and the working class experience.
Yes, so there are, I think, two major dimensions which are related to each other and to the way in which Hungary inserted back into the global economy after the collapse of socialism. So Hungary relied on foreign investment as a key driver of economic growth, and these transnational corporations brought a lot of innovation, and they allowed for the emergence of a very competitive export sector, which was very, very important. But in itself, it didn't solve all kinds of social and economic tensions, and in fact contributed to some of those tensions. One is in the area of social, what I call in the book, social disintegration. So even though you had this relatively high level of growth after 1990, it didn't lead to the creation of jobs. So Hungary had very low employment rate right until Viktor Orbán took power. The other is that there was a very steep increase in inequalities in the 90s. Also related to this was a very significant mortality crisis in the 90s that I show in my other research, especially in the industrialized areas. You had a wave or an epidemic of what is now in the US called deaths of despair that similarly unfolded in Hungary in the 90s. And although in the 90s people were hopeful that things would get better, they didn't see their wages grow fast enough. Many people took out debts, unsustainable debts, and this whole thing collapsed already before the financial crisis hit Hungary. And you had 2/3 of Hungarians who thought that they were worse off financially in the second half of the 2000s than before the regime change. So there was a massive disillusionment with the way this kind of liberal economic policy was implemented in Hungary, and led to a massive disillusionment with the economic system, not so much with political democracy. And so this is what people wanted to see, a change in the way that economy is structured. And I think you can already see the parallels with the support for populism in the industrialized areas in the West. In the UK, you see the same with the industrialized regions moving to support populist parties. In the US, you also see this as a major shift, from 2012 to 2016 with Trump's success in the Midwest Rust Belt areas. So this is not something that is very specific to Hungary, but still frequently neglected and hit Hungary quite severely. And the other dimension that I look at is how this mismanaged economic dependent integration into the global economy has led to the polarization of business elites in the country. So basically,
just a second before we talk about that, are there any statistics that you think are particularly important that kind of illustrate the situation you're describing with the deindustrialization, the mortality crisis, the wage, the earning potential or earning power decrease? Are there any numbers that you think really illustrate the situation?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. So in the book, I give tons of data on this. Both quantitative and that's where the 82 interviews come in with workers in these Hungary's Rust Belt areas. So just to give you a feel of what was happening. So for example, in the US, in the most severely deindustrialized metropolitan areas, such as, the biggest metropolitan areas, New York, Philadelphia, which lost a lot of manufacturing employment in the 70s and 80s, you had a decline in manufacturing employment around 30% over 2 decades. In Hungary, the average decline in manufacturing employment over 6 years, 7 years, from the very end of the 80s until 95 was 40% on average. But in the most severely hit regions in the country, you have towns, medium-sized towns that are very important regional centers, where you had a more than 50% decline in industrial employment. So this really created a severe, basically, suffering and dislocation and all kinds of problems. And this is what was associated with the mortality crisis as well in these regions. In one of the papers on this that we did, we find that there is actually a very significant association between severe deindustrialization and higher mortality. So people who live in the industrialized areas have around 20% higher chance of dying than people in less severely industrialized areas in the country. If you look at wages, then the real wage of an average Hungarian, and this is average, not looking at the the working class or the bottom 40%, average real wage in the country in 2009 was only around 12 or 13% higher than it was at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. So this was basically the heydays of goulash socialism in Hungary. So you have these 3 decades, including 2 decades of neoliberal market reforms, and then basically the wages are there. And at the same time, you have a total collapse of public services, housing that was previously provided, all kinds of services that people could use for free. These were mostly eliminated or transferred to companies that want money for this. So, for example, housing was completely privatized, which means that before the regime change, people could get housing at a greatly subsidized prices, or the company would help them buy the houses. After the transition, there was no basically social housing left anymore in the country. It was the first sectors to be completely privatized. So it's now up to the people to buy their homes. And this is one of the major reasons which led to the extreme levels of indebtedness by the end of the 2000s. And this all happened under the 8 years of the Socialist Party's government. They govern in coalition with the Hungarian Liberal Party. And although they were committed to some social policies, progressive social policies as well, overall, they presided over the most, let's say, avant-garde neoliberal measures like privatization of public utilities, privatization of the pension system, major massive austerity packages. And then at the end of the 2000s, they also tried to privatize health insurance, and they failed ultimately. And this was the time when especially working class voters disillusioned with the Socialist Party, and they either just stayed home and didn't vote, or some of them also went to support Fidesz, or the radical right-wing party Jobbik.
Okay, great. And so then what is the role that the business elites played in all of this?
Yeah, so you can't really actually blame these people for what happened later, because as the book argues, they wanted to change the economic system, but they didn't really want to change the political system. And so you would also have to look at the elites to understand what was happening. And there you can also see a kind of disintegration, an economic disintegration. And to put it very shortly and simplify it, you have highly competitive transnational corporations on the one side that provide the bulk of the exports technologically sophisticated companies, like, you know, all the major European car manufacturing companies, but also electronics companies. And on the other hand, you have domestically owned companies, and there's very little economic connection between them. There are no linkages. The economics literature calls these forward and backward linkages that are not really existing. So although you have this competitive foreign sector, it doesn't really pull the rest of the economy with itself. So the Hungarian economy is deeply polarized, and domestic capitalists that managed to gain a foothold in the economy, they started to grow frustrated with this same liberal regime as the workers, and they started to lobby for more economic nationalism, but also for the reduction of some of the welfare services, the liberalization of the labor code. So typically unpopular measures that under normal democratic circumstances would be very hard to implement, but they were pushing for them. And Viktor Orban allied with these domestic capitalists and promised them a new kind of basically economic nationalist policy. But Viktor Orban, after he took power, he also kept transnational corporations mostly intact. In fact, their role in the export has just increased, and technologically intensive manufacturing transnational corporations, like again German manufacturing companies, play an even more important role than they previously did. But in non-technological, non-export sectors, Orban made room for domestic capitalists. Right? For example, if you look at banking, or the energy sector, or retail sector, these are sectors where Orban is intervening in the economy to make room for national capitalists. And other than that, he implemented all kinds of employment and social policies, which basically amounted to massive redistribution from the bottom to the top to accelerate capital accumulation and the embourgeoisement of the upper middle class, and to keep the loyalty of transnational corporations. So they restructured the labor code, liberalized it heavily. They reduced the rights of trade unions. They introduced a flat income tax that benefits mostly the upper 20%. Hungary now has the lowest tax on corporations. So the corporate tax rate in Europe is the lowest now in Hungary, thanks to Viktor Orbán's tax reforms. So all these business-friendly policies are meant to help domestic capitalists, to keep the loyalty of transnational corporations. So although Viktor Orbán, relied on the economic anger of working class voters to get catapult back into power, in all honesty, he duped them, and he needs to do something to stay in power, and he does two things. One, he's getting more and more authoritarian, so he restructures the institutional landscape so he can be ousted. And the other thing he does, he runs these populist campaigns and populist politics that helps to create consent even among those people who would be victims. So, right, for example, people who fear downward mobility, they don't want to end up in the same category as the poor. So if a politician bashes the poor, then this will be popular among people who are afraid of sliding downwards. This is a nasty, typical neoconservative strategy that Viktor Orbán relies on. So I call this in the book authoritarian populist strategy, and the other is restructuring the institutional landscape, which allows him to basically maintain this regime of upward redistribution. Again, if you want to simplify it very much, it's a kind of regime of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor under Viktor Orbán.
Right, and so then this is where sort of the xenophobia, the anti-immigrant rhetoric would come in as well, right?
Exactly. It helps to stabilize the support of Viktor Orbán, even among those who are actually losing out. And it's also very important to see that Viktor Orbán's party is not extremely popular So, right, he's not in power because he's so extremely overwhelmingly popular. His ability to stay in power really relies on these two strategies. And just one figure, in 2014, so 4 years after being elected for, to the prime ministership in 2010, they won again with two-thirds majority. But the number of votes that they received was actually fewer than they received in 2006 when they lost the election. So they were able to stay in power with fewer votes than in 2006, then they lost the election. So this shows you what major effect all this gerrymandering and restructuring and conquering the media has. It can tilt the playing field so that Fidesz can stay in power even losing votes. And then later on, with the migration crisis, they actually managed to gain back some more voters, but especially recomposing the electorate after losing some of the working class supporters. Now it's the people really in the most depressed regions that tend to support Viktor Orbán, which is quite paradoxical because they are the ones also who are losing, but then they are also the ones who are most severely punished politically with various populist and institutional strategies. So it's a very clever mixture to prop up his his majority, even in the face of highly unpopular measures.
Okay. So my next question then is, you've done all this research, we've looked at the economics. How do you know that this is causation instead of correlation with the democratic backsliding?
Of course, it's always the biggest question in social science, right? And how do you know that it's not just correlation but causation? And you can never be certain, of course. But the type of research that I have done is called process tracing, which is really geared towards establishing the causal mechanism, how what you might call upstream political economic factors like the disintegration of the economy, the disintegration of the society, leads in time dynamically how it is connected to the demobilization of the working class, and then Fidesz's ability to remobilize the working class, etc., etc. So it's a very carefully reconstructed process tracing, a carefully reconstructed causal narrative. And if you look at the evidence from other countries, this causal narrative, you can find evidence from other regions of the world. So this, I think, again shows that this is not just some random thing. It's not like any random correlation that you could think of. Like, for example, as I mentioned, with the support of after the U.S. elections, let's focus on Trump's ability to win in 2016, hinged really on his ability to attract working class voters in a few crucial swing states in the Rust Belt. So these were Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, where he was really able to attract a constituency that was previously solidly Democratic, but then was disillusioned with the Democrats' neoliberal turn, and then switched loyalty to the Republican Party. You can observe the same process in these deindustrialized regions of Hungary that used to be the regional strongholds of the Socialist Party. Right, they also lost voters in rural areas with smaller villages, but those never have been their regional strongholds, whereas these industrial towns were. So losing those voters is crucial for their ability for Fidesz's ability to mobilize and create a social coalition that allows him majority. And then the result is is a theory. So it's not just empirical facts randomly there, but you also have a theoretical explanation for how all this is linked together. So I'm operating at a level of theories. I'm operating with generalizations with other countries, and I'm operating with a very careful empirical reconstruction of a historical narrative in one particular case.
Okay, great. So we have Gergely, the president of Budapest, joining us. I also just realized that there were questions in the chat. I had only the private chat. I didn't realize I had to toggle over to a comment section. So we're going to hear a little bit from the mayor, and then we'll get to the questions from other colleagues in Italy. So welcome. And Noemi is going to help us translate. So thank you so much for being here. First question, can you just tell us a little bit about what's happening on the ground right now with COVID and coronavirus, and sort of how Orbán is responding to all of this?
Lefordítsuk a kérdést, vagy...
Nem fontos.
Oké.
Jó estét, és köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget. Gáborral van egy közös múltunk a mozgalomból, de a világ megértésében az előző életemben én is próbáltam foglalkozni, azóta buta politikus lettem, de a Gábor könyvét például olvastam.
Okay, so hi everyone. It's very nice to be here. I have shared history with Gabor from back in the day, and I became a silly politician. I was also very busy with trying to understand, make sense of the world, just like Gabor does.
So Gergely,
Magyarországot a koronavírus járvány egy olyan 10 év után találta meg, amikor a szociális és az egészségügyi ellátórendszer nagyon nagy mértékben vissza lett fejlesztve, ezért nagyon kritikus a helyzet.
Yeah, so the crisis hit Hungary at a very crucial point where after 10 years of Orbán's government, just as Gabor talked about this or discussed it, so the health system under the Orbán's government was totally distracted. Funds were taken out of the system. So yeah, it's a very crucial point in Hungary in terms of the corona crisis right now.
Ráadásul az Orbán kormány népszerűségét az elmúlt 10 évben többé-kevésbé azzal is lehet magyarázni, hogy azért volt egyfajta gazdasági növekedés, és volt egy lecsorgás az alsó középosztályok felé, és a politikai népszerűségüket ez a gazdasági siker okozta. Ezért a kormány nagyon próbálta elkerülni azokat a korlátozó intézkedéseket, amelyek a munkahelyek biztonságát, vagy a gazdaság teljesítményét korlátoznak.
And the reason why this is crucial for the Orbán government is because there was some slight of economic growth under the regime that trickled down to some extent to upper middle class and middle class families. And that's exactly why Orbán was trying to avoid the policies, the kind of policies that, for example, Italy has, that too much.
Yeah, so they wanted to avoid any kind of situation where people would be hurt financially, and they try to keep the economy growing. So their interventions are really focusing on keeping economic growth alive, because that's one crucial aspect of their political success as well, as Gergely said.
És a magyar egészségügy nagyon közel állt ahhoz, hogy az első hullámban Olaszországodra hasonló drámai képeket lássunk, és éppen tegnap a miniszterelnök végül is meglépte azokat a korlátozásokat, amelyeket egyébként minden szakmai szervezet korábban már kért.
Yeah, so right now Hungary is at a point where, which is very similar to what Italy looked like and the northern regions of Italy looked like in the first wave. So it was only yesterday that Orbán decided to finally take on the policies that quite a few organizations and NGOs were fighting for already.
Ami a gazdaságot illeti, azok az intézkedések, amit a kormány eddig tett a kieső jövedelmek pótlására, ezek európai összehasonlításban nagyon szerények, és valójában a vállalkozásokat támogató döntések voltak, a munkahelyek megtartását vagy a kiesett jövedelmeket pótló döntések nem nagyon.
So the majority of the interventions of the government was focusing on, as we said previously, on keeping the economic engine alive. But there was very little funds allocated to actually helping the unemployed, or there was very little or no investment into new social policies to help those who would end up in poverty. So everything is concentrated on economic growth.
Az egész Orbán kormány filozófiájában az egy nagyon egyértelmű pillér, hogy jövedelmet csak munkával lehet szerezni, minden más jövedelem az erkölcstelen. És ezt az ideológiai dogmát nem tudják átlépni még ebben a nehéz helyzetben sem.
So, in the philosophy of the Orbán government, the most crucial thing is that you have an income through work. So, work is a very central topic in the philosophy of the Orbán government. So that's why they think that any kind of income that is, that you get not from the traditional kinds of work are considered unethical. So that's why they were waiting for so long not to interfere in this kind of aspect, because this is a pillar of the Orbán government philosophy. Work. You should work.
És úgy tűnik, hogy nem akarnak ezen változtatni, úgyhogy nagyon kiszámíthatatlan, hogy a járvány és a gazdasági válságnak milyen politikai hatása lehet Magyarországon. Vannak arra utaló jelek, hogy az erős kéz politikai itt is működik, és az emberek a biztonságot keresik, és ezt megtalálják a kormányban, de hogyha az a hangulat, hogy itt azért napról napra jobban lehet élni, ez megtörik, és az összeomlik az egészségügy, akkor ennek az ellenkezőjébe következhet.
Yeah, so right now everything is uncertain because of this. Economy.
So on the one hand, you could have a scenario where a strongman politics allows Viktor Orbán to survive politically, and he's always good with strongman politics. But on the other hand, he could end up with a serious social crisis as well, because of the mismanagement, basically, of the corona crisis. So there are basically multiple options ahead, and it's still uncertain which one will actually unfold.
Okay, let's go to some questions from my colleagues. Starting with Andrea Affaticati from ntv.de. If you were asked to name what mistakes that the EU has made, which one would you name?
Szerinted, Gergő, milyen hibákat vétett az EU? In terms of handling the corona crisis, or
I think in general, in terms of enabling the democratic backsliding in Hungary.
Okay.
Ha egy hibát kellene megnevezned, amit az EU elkövetett, akkor melyik lenne az Magyarországgal kapcsolatban?
Az elmúlt, tehát nem a mostani időszakban, a korábbi időszakban.
Úgy értjük, hogy úgy általában a demokráciával kapcsolatban, igen.
Hát... nem tudok egyet mondani kapásból. Szerintem több is van. A magyar belpolitikában az a leképződése a magyar kormány és az EU közötti vitának, hogy az EU mindig azt mondja, hogy most már nem tűrjük tovább, és aztán végén Orbán Viktor megnyeri a csatát, és hazahozza a pénzt. Ez a magyar választópolgár így néz az EU-ra.
Exactly. I'm sorry. So this play with the EU usually looks like that they are usually very angry at Viktor Orban, and there are some kind of debates within the EU about how he dismantles the democratic institutions. But then at the end of this play, Orban usually wins and takes home all the money. So that's how Hungarian voters look at the EU right now.
Ezért én egyébként egyetértek azzal, hogy a jogállamisági kritériumokat számon kell kérni a tagállamokon, de az a vita, ami a demokráciát úgy mutatja be, hogy itt különböző kisebbségi társadalmi csoportok vagy szép eszmék állnak szemben az emberek hétköznapi biztonságával és a települések Európai Uniós támogatásával, ez egy nagyon-nagyon rossz dihotómia, és ezt a magyar belpolitikában ezt tökéletesen ki lehet játszani az EU-val szemben.
Okay, so any kind of conflict that is constructed in a way that is between a capable state and the security of citizens on the one hand, and some abstract democratic principles or rights of various kinds of minorities, it will be always fuel the government's political popularity. This is a wrong way to frame these debates.
De az Európa nem csak hibákat követel, tehát azt gondolom, hogy a válságkezelésnek az az irány, amit most látunk, ez egy helyes irány. Most egy óriási tőkeinjekció kell, hogy a válság az ne gyűrözzön tovább, és örülök, hogy az Európai Unió ezen az úton indult el.
But the EU does not only make mistakes, they actually handling this crisis quite well, and what we need right now is a huge injunction of funds for the countries from the EU, and Gergely sees that this is the path that the EU is on right now.
És egy dolgot nagyon világosan kell látni. Ugye az európai városok, én Budapestre elindítottak egy erős lobbit a városok közvetlen finanszírozásának érdekében.
And right now, the European capitals started a movement or something like that towards the EU, and they were asking for funds from the EU for the EU capitals to handle this crisis.
Ez a vita
directly to cities as opposed to going through the government first.
Yes.
Ez a vita nagyon egyszerűen lefordítható tulajdonképpen. Az Európai Uniónak el kell döntenie azt, hogy az őt egyébként ellenfélként kezelő kormányokat, vagy pedig az őt szövetségesként kezelő városokat finanszírozzák.
So the EU is now facing the decision whether they should finance the opposing the governments that opposes the governments that oppose the EU, or the capitals or the towns within these countries that are favorable for the EU.
És lehet még egy gondolat a Gábor könyvéhez kapcsolódóan, meg az Európai Unió és Magyarország konfliktusra kapcsolat. Tehát ugye Gábor ugye egy felhalmozó államról ír, az egész EU-magyar kormány konfliktus arról szól, hogy az Európai Uniós források felhasználásával létrejön egy magyar tőkés osztály, ami egyébként az EU-val szemben fogalmazza az identitását. Tehát tulajdonképpen ma egy Európai Uniós ellenes politikát finanszíroz az Európai Unió.
So, referring back to my book, Gergely highlighted that it's a very paradoxical situation where the EU funds are being used to create a new national bourgeoisie in Hungary. So this is something that the EU elites should really consider. Do they really want to fund a political project that defines itself in opposition to European integration, essentially?
And that describes itself as literally an illiberal democracy.
Exactly.
From the EU money.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next question. We have James Imam, who asks, can you give us the latest on Orban's transformation of arts institutions? And why are arts institutions so important to him? I understand that since Orbán placed Sylvester Okavács as head of the Hungarian State Opera, the theater made headlines for canceling performances of Billy Elliot the ballet, apparently because it depicts homosexuality, and for writing George Gershwin's estate a letter explaining that for performances of Porgy and Bess, which asks for a black chorus to be used, after that the question cuts off.
Yeah. Tehát a kérdés arra vonatkozik.
Értem, azt hiszem értem. Két összetevője van ennek a dolognak. Az egyik az, hogy az elmúlt 10 évben a Fidesz elfoglalt gyakorlatilag minden szférát, a kultúrában voltak lemaradva, tekintettel arra, hogy a populistáknak ez nem erős terepe, hiszen valójában az elit kultúra az kívül áll az ő politikai célterületeiken.
So in the last 10 years, basically, Fidesz and the Orbán government managed to overtake all of the cultural institutions in the country, which prior that wasn't their biggest strength, because as you might know, that populists are not famous for following high culture. But now in Hungary, it's true that they are in every institution and every theater.
Tehát az egyik elem az, hogy már elfoglaltak mindent, most a kultúra következik. A másik pedig az, hogy ők, a populisták mindig a polarizációból élnek, és a polarizációhoz újabb és újabb ellenségképek kellenek, és társadalmi normák, amelyekért aggódni kell. És most elérkeztek odáig, hogy tulajdonképpen a család és a heteronormatív világkép az, aminek a védelmében politizálniuk kell, mert már elfogytak a migránsok, az Európai Unió, ezek megkoptak már ezek az ellenségképek.
Yeah, so overtaking all of the institutions was only one part of the picture. The second part of the picture is oh God. The second part of the picture is polarization, because populists are only strong if they manage to build up very strong enemy images constantly. And the Orbán government did that with the EU, with the migrant crisis, things like that. But these enemy images are starting to wear off. Basically, so now their latest is to focus on the very traditional old family values and protect the family and this conservative image of family from outside, for example, from homosexuality.
És ugye az elit kultúra támadása mögött azért fölsejlik ez a szempont, és most, amikor beszélgettünk, éppen ebben a fél órával ezelőtt nyújtottak be egy alaptörvénymódosítást, ami kimondja, hogy a házasság az egy férfi és egy nő szent köteléke.
They just like half an hour ago introduced a new proposal that would define marriage as a holy bond between a man and a woman.
És tehát ha meg akarjuk érteni a populista rezsimeket, akkor fontos, hogy ők ilyen nemzetközi sztenderdekkel dolgoznak, és például a lengyel elnökválasztási kampány tematikáját látjuk felfedezni Magyarországon a kulturális politikában.
Yeah, so to understand populists is to understand the concepts they are working with, and these are pretty standard concepts throughout the nations and in between nations as well. For example, in Poland right now, in the presidential elections, the message was very similar to the Orbán's government protection of this holy bond of family.
Okay. Our next question is from Giovanni Vegezzi from El Economista, a Spanish outlet. Do you think that Italy, after the COVID recession and crisis, could shift towards a hybrid regime in case of a victory for far-right political parties? These include the Lega or Fratelli d'Italia, who are partners of Fidesz in Europe and actually lead in the polls with almost 40%.
Ezt nem pontosan értem.
Nem tudjuk pontosan kihez szól a kérdés. Who's supposed to answer the... So a kérdés arra vonatkozik, hogy
whoever feels most inspired to answer.
Arra vonatkozott, hogy a koronaválság után elképzelhető, hogy Olaszországban is egy hasonló hibrid rezsim alakuljon ki, ahol gyakorlatilag a jobb oldal, populista jobb oldal különböző pártjainak most már összesen 40%-a van, és jó eséllyel mostanának választások megnyernék a választást. Nem volt világos, hogy kihez szól a kérdés, szóval, hogyha bárki, aki Gergely, ha...
Én passzolom.
Gabor will answer.
Okay, so it takes a lot to get there where Hungary is, and it takes a very stable majority, social majority as well, and a deeply embedded, structurally embedded support, which Viktor Orbán has enjoyed, both in segments of society at the bottom, like disillusioned workers, but also in economic elites, and an ability to overtake institutions. And although I think right-wing populists might be able to cause serious damage as well in Italy, I think that sliding down, and ending up where Hungary is now would be, from my perspective, would be a really big surprise, because of the conditions are just not as severe as they were in Hungary. The economic disintegration is not as severe. The social disintegration is not as severe. So there would be a backlash earlier against policies and restructurings that were successfully implemented in Hungary. It's also important to see that whereas in Hungary, the populist vote was monopolized by the populist right, in Italy, it's polarized. So you also have a sort of a left-leaning populist party with Cinque Stelle, who was now able to form a government with the Democratic Party. So economic anger is also channeled on the left in Italy, at least partially. So this again makes the picture a little bit different in the two countries.
But is there anything that, maybe Italy should be kind of paying attention to in Hungary and sort of treading lightly in any way?
So I think the most important issue is for not to allow, like if you are a centrist guy or a centrist politician, or if you are elite, the most important issue is not to allow a right-wing populist mobilization of all kinds of cultural and economic grievances. And you do that if you are able to present a more progressive framing of the same social problems, right? So if you leave all the critique of the elites to the right, it will look nasty and horrible. So you'll have to find a more progressive way of reforming structures and talking about social and economic problems. That's one crucial lesson, I think, politically, from Hungary. But also, if you look at the case of Poland, it's very similar. You had also a centrist left that increasingly moved to the right. And when the left moves to the right, there the space opens up for the right to mobilize economic anger. And this can provide a really stable ground for populist forces to do all kinds of nasty things. And then another maybe is just to try to find whatever ways you can not to allow decentralized structures and institutions to be taken over that easily as they were in Hungary. Now it's easy to say, but maybe Hungarians didn't always mobilize enough to protect some of these institutions. That's, I think, also very, very important.
Okay. Our next question is from Colleen Berry with the Associated Press. She asks, to what extent did or does Orbán take legitimacy from a Trump presidency?
Gergely, akarsz válaszolni?
Hogy
Én nem pontosan értem a kérdést.
Hogy mennyire befolyásolja Orbán legitimációját, hogy befolyásolta Trump elnökséget?
Nagyon nagy mértékben.
Very much.
Van egy magyar pszichológus, aki azt mondta, hogy Orbán egy olyan szélkakas, aki mindig arra fordul, ahonnan fog fújni a szél. Ezt nem tudom, hogy lehet lefordítani, pedig pontos lenne.
Yeah.
So Orbán is a kind of politician who always senses where the new favorable trends are going to point towards in the future. He's able to sense future trends and directions.
És ez azért is fontos, mert a populisták azt mondják magukról, hogy ők valójában a normálishoz való visszatérést jelentik, az aberrált, a szélsőségesen liberális világhoz képest. És hogyha valaki egyszerűen csak normális, akkor az nagyon nehéz ezt úgy megvalósítani, hogy nincsenek nemzetközi referenciák, akik ugyanúgy a normalitást képviselnék. Ezért az Orbán a politikájában a külföldi példák, Lengyelország, Trump, a brazil elnök, akik persze mind borzasztó politikát képviselnek, de legitimálták őt a saját választóközönség előtt.
So populism is defending normalcy against all these liberal aberrations, these extreme cultural liberalism, that harms the supposed traditional norms that supposedly families cherish, according to populist discourses. So that's why it's very important for populists to be able to show that there are fellow soldiers fighting the same battle and protecting the same normalcy that is being attacked by these horrible extreme liberals who want to abuse cherished old values.
Okay.
If I can, just one.
Yeah.
So this is extremely important what Gergely said, and I think Trump's loss will definitely not help Viktor Orbán to find his way towards getting reelected again. And it might also hurt him financially with the new Biden government. But then on the other hand, we also have to take into consideration that Orbán won 2 elections with 2-thirds majority with Barack Obama in the White House. So although these are all very important and a populist in the White House helps, if he's clever enough and is able to play on the social and economic tensions domestically, as he was able before Trump was elected, then he can pull it off, but it's harder. So if he has an ally in the White House, that's definitely easier, makes it much easier for him.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Tanya Dordovich. She asks, what's going on? What's happening with freedom of media and freedom of the press in Hungary? Recently, all the journalists resigned from Hungary's main independent news site Index.
Ezt érted, Gergely?
Igen.
Szerintem ez nagyon jó kérdés.
Ugye nagyon furcsa kép van a magyar médiában, mert valóban a Fidesz elfoglalt nagyon sok orgánumot, fölvásárolt, de ezeknek az elérése nagyon nagy mértékben visszaesett. Tehát a fogyasztók többé-kevésbé visszakompenzálták ezt, és tulajdonképpen ahhoz képest, hogy mennyi erőforrás fektetett a Fidesz a médiapolitikájába, ahhoz képest kevés független szavazót ért el. Viszont megint a populizmus lényege a polarizáció, az, hogy buborékban tartsa a szavazóit. És ehhez viszont az a médiapolitika, amit csináltak, ez erre működik. És egyszerűen a szavazóikkal azt is elhitetik vele, hogy Trump az egy csalás révén lett leváltva. Tehát akkora már ez a buborék, és olyan mértékben elszigeteli a saját szavazóit a valós információktól, hogy már le tud mondani arról, hogy más szavazókat megnyerjen.
What's interesting in Hungary is that even though they paid a lot of money to overtake all of the major news organizations, and yes, there were a lot of for example, with the index, in the question. But on the newsreader side, people usually find the independent outlets by themselves anyway. But why this is very important for Fidesz is that they can create a strong bubble, alternative reality, where they can seal away their readership from, from any kind of any kind of alternative news. For example, right now they are very strong on the Trump agenda, that Trump didn't lose the election, but they stole away from him. So yeah.
It's successful in a sense to create an alternative reality, but there's also a very high cost that Fidesz has to pay for this, and they are also losing a lot of the undecided voters who were readers of these media outlets that were perceived as more independent. And as soon as Fidesz takes them over, they lose the more independent-minded and undecided voters. But what they can do is basically create a hardcore followership based on the hardcore media. But then the task of the opposition is to find a way to communicate to the undecided, I think.
Okay. Next question is from Claudia Fnisi. This will go straight to Gergely. Who else might be positioned to take over in case Orbán's position falters on either side politically?
What was it again? What was it?
Who might be positioned to take over if Orbán's position falters?
Ki lesz a következő miniszterelnök?
Hát az ellenzék éppen odáig már eljutott, hogy közösen induljon a választáson. Nyilván lesz egy közös miniszterelnök jelölt. Aztán nagyon fontosnak gondolom, hogy előválasztás révén válasszák ki, tehát ez az ellenzék széttagolt, és az alkuk azok általában nagyon rossz eredményekkel járnak. Én azt gondolom, hogy egy kicsit a Bideni modell működhet, tehát minél kevésbé megosztó egy jelölt, annál jobb lehet, mert Orbán eleme az a polarizáció. És ennek a polarizációnak kéne ellentartani az ellenzék stratégiájában, nem belemenni abba a küzdelembe, amiben bele akarnak szorítani minket. Az, hogy szimbolikus ügyekben kiálljunk, ahelyett, hogy az emberek hétköznapi problémáival foglalkoznánk.
So this is an open question at the moment. So the parties of the opposition is highly divided. They started to work out the details of the cooperation. Yes, the cooperation. What Gergely thinks is highly important is to find the next lead candidate of the opposition, so the prime ministerial candidate, through some form of primary. So basically in the same way as they do in the US. And then also the American model followed by Biden could be also in some ways helpful to replicate in Hungary in terms of not. So whereas Viktor Orbán is a politician who polarizes society, if the opposition projects an image of integration and the opposite of polarization, that would help. So it would be, according to Gergely, it would be very important not to get into all the culture war that Fidesz is trying to force on the opposition, but talk about everyday livelihood issues that are more important for people.
Okay. There was actually just an article that came out in Time magazine a few days ago with Gergely basically saying that, 2022 could be the last chance to defeat Orbán, restore democratic institutions in Hungary. And, I think it's been pretty fairly well established that the challenge of going up against someone like Orban or Donald Trump is that they just really suck all the air out of the room, and really like all the attention is kind of on them. So I'm curious, I would ask, I guess, both of you, what do you think that the narrative needs to be coming from the opposition in order to kind of regain some of this political ground?
Mindkettőnket kérdezi. Nem tudom, hogy értetted, de az volt a lényege, hogy tulajdonképpen mi lenne szerintünk a sikeres narratívának a lényege ahhoz, hogy az ellenzék eredményes tudjon lenni az Orbánnal szemben.
And I guess I would add, because Gergely did sort of address that, from a policy perspective, I guess, what would be kind of important to emphasize?
Mik lennének azok a policy-k, az közpolitikai ügyek, amikre az ellenzék hangsúlyt kellene fektetni?
Hadd induljak egy kicsit az én kampányomból, amely azért nem volt teljesen sikertelen, amely arról szólt, hogy a budapestiek visszaszerzik a városukat. Tehát a polarizáció az nem társadalmi csoportok között volt, hanem a hatalmi elit, amihez képest a város visszaszerzi az önrendelkezését. Én ugyanezt csinálnám országosan, tehát akkor tudjuk ezt a polarizációs politikát hatástalanítani, hogyha a polarizációt egy szűk elit, egyébként egy valóban létező, hát tulajdonképpen ennek a felhalmozó állam csúcs elitjevel szemben fogalmazzuk meg. Tehát azt mondjuk, hogy mi a 99%-ot képviseljük. Szerintem egy ilyen kampány, amely tehát ez lehet egy sikeres politikai narratíva Magyarországon.
Okay, so what would make, according to Gergely, the opposition competitive is if the opposition would be able to frame the polarization as between basically a small elite that runs the state. Gergely used the same word as I use in the book. So there's this accumulative state that is geared towards creating a new bourgeoisie and redistributing money upwards. And then the opposition would be able to convince society that it's basically a conflict between the 1% and the 99% or something like that. So we would have to reframe the polarization as between big social groups like Fidesz does, cultural conflicts between big social groups, as a conflict between the elite who occupy the state, whereas the 90% of Hungarian society. Yeah, I would fully agree with this. I think that's highly that's I think very, very important. But of course we're a member of the same party, so thinking is a little bit influenced in that way. And I think I would also add one thing from the history of Hungary. So and also is Gergely. So he was successfully elected as mayor recently, but there was another mayoral election in 2014. Actually, when Fidesz was relatively unpopular, as I said, in 2014, they received less votes in the national elections than they did in 2006. So they weren't really in their best position. And then the opposition ended up backing a candidate who was a finance minister in '95, who was a well-known figure, was a leading economist working for the World Bank as well, and who was responsible for implementing some of the most severe austerity measures in the 90s. And one of the biggest burdens the opposition is carrying right now in Hungary is something that Fidesz is very consciously building, is associating the opposition with the financial and economic hardships that plagued Hungary in the 90s and 2000s. So I think there are two ways to get out of this deadlock. One is you have to have nominees that are in person representing a new era. Like I think that guy, the former finance minister, lost by quite a big margin against the candidate of Fidesz. But then 4 years later, you had a new, more kind of progressive candidate who was able to beat the incumbent mayor. And I think one of the reasons is that the strategy of Fidesz to slur Gergely as the representative of the same old guard who stole the country in the 90s and created all these financial hardships didn't work so well. So this image, this political identity would have to be translated also in policy terms. And you'd have to be able to create, a narrative that would be able to convince all those people who are actually losing out under Viktor Orbán, but because of this culture war, are either not voting or voting for Fidesz. So that would be, I think, the winning strategy to reframe those grievances in a way that favors the opposition, to create a game, to create a play where the opposition can actually win. If the game is about culture war, Fidesz will win. If the game is about new inequalities, then the opposition with a strong message on social policy and economic policy has actually the opportunity. But also the institutional side is also very important. So there would have to be a very strong cooperation and very strong loyalty towards the leader. So one of the things that the opposition usually manages to get completely wrong is the way the oppositional coalition, they end up forming the oppositional coalition after a long procedure of infighting. And that's extremely harmful. So do the primary and then just unite.
Right, which I think is what we actually saw with Biden in 2020 compared to 2016. I think the Democratic Party really kind of recovered its unity after the primary this time in a way that perhaps they didn't last time.
Yeah, and it's hugely important. And I consider that Hungary, the US is a two-party system. And in Hungary, you have about 6 or 7 parties in the opposition. So it's much harder to unite those forces. Well, I think Gergely is a modest guy. But I think, you are looking at a very likely prime ministerial candidate. He doesn't like because he's a good mayor and he's doing his job well, and he's always saying that he wants to concentrate on being.
I will say that the journalist from Time had the same speculations, so it's not just a friend speaking.
I don't want to hurt Gergely's chances as a mayor, so that's just my.
Okay. Well, great. I think that's all of our questions. Is there anything else that either of you want to add that you think is important, relevant to the conversation, something we might have overlooked?
Akarsz valamit hozzátenni? Gergely, mindent? No. I'm just, nagyon szépen köszönöm, Gergely, ez egy hatalmas.
Én köszönöm.
Hogy csatlakoztál, és nagyon örülök, hogy tudtunk így.
Én is.
Beszélgetni egy kicsit. I just expressed my deep gratitude towards my old friend, if I might say so, and towards Gergely, who's really appreciate that. I really appreciate that he found the time to join us for this discussion.
Yes, thank you both. Very much appreciated.
And thank you, of course, Jana, for pulling this off, and all the people at the Foreign Press Association, and for your interest in our work, both politically and also the research work. And
thank you to Roberto behind the scenes, who's handling all the live stream. So yeah. Great. I guess that's it. Everyone have a nice night, and thank you again so much. Thank you also to all our questions, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.